Good morning. Glad to see all of you all the time. Every time that we get to be together, I cherish and love and appreciate this time with my people. Not to say other Christians. We spent this summer, traveling to all kinds of fun adventures, and the recurring theme for me was that we love to be with other Christians and other churches and everything, and that's always a blessing as well. But there is a special sense in which this is our church. These are our people, and it's good to be with you, and I'm glad to be here. We are getting back into Genesis today. And as you kind of see on here, Genesis part 3. And it's called Abraham. Genesis part 3, Abraham. Now, Abraham it is impossible to overstate the importance in the biblical story of Abraham. He is the forerunner of the people of God. He is the great patriarch. He stands as an absolutely towering figure in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. He factors majorly into the theology of the New Testament, where Paul goes to great lengths in multiple long passages, Romans 4 and Galatians 3, to make the case that believers in Jesus are offspring of Abraham. And Abraham himself is presented as the model of the offspring of the woman. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in Genesis chapter 3, we see that humanity falls because of their sin. And what God tells Eve, the woman, in Genesis 3, is he makes a promise that there's going to be ongoing conflict between the serpent and Eve, between the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of Eve. Now, we framed this largely, we talked about this a little bit last week, as this is spiritual warfare. All of human history is a conflict between the purposes of God and the purposes of his great enemy, the devil. Now, that's not a conflict between two equal and opposing powers. Christians are not dualists in the sense that the cosmos is a contest between two equally powerful beings. That's not the biblical story at all. But the devil, or the serpent, is an absolutely deadly enemy. And so this conflict begins to unfold throughout the story of Genesis. And so you see, for example, this expanding scope of influence, frankly, of the serpent from Genesis 3 through Genesis 11. And one of the broad points you might make of those first 11 chapters is that it seems like the devil takes the first few rounds of this conflict. Right? So Genesis 3, there's going to be conflict between the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of Eve. And then what's the very next story in the Bible? Cain murdering Abel. And then what happens from there? Well, you get Cain builds a city. And this expands to where by Genesis 6, you have wicked men that are multiplying on the face of the earth, and that leads to what? The flood. And so what happens then is that you look at that and you get to Genesis 6 and you kind of on a certain level you think, well, it looks like the serpent took that round. It looks like he took the round between Cain and Abel. It looks like he took the round building the city. And it looks like he took the round for the world, where he multiplies such wickedness and evil on the ground that God just wipes it all out. Well, so God starts over with Noah. And then from Genesis, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, you again see that there's an expanding scope of influence, because by the time you get to Genesis 11, what do we find there? Babylon. Now it's translated there, Tower of Babel, but the Hebrew word Bavel, every single other time in the Hebrew Bible, Bavel, it's Babylon. It's the Tower of Babylon. And so once again, it's escalated. And the scope of evil and the influence of the devil has expanded such that it's this mega super city, the tower, the kingdom of Babylon. And then you turn the page and you get to Genesis chapter 12. And what I would say, then, we could frame it this way. Chapter 12 begins God's counterattack. And his counterattack is a man from the very heart of evil. Abraham is from Babylon. His family is from Babylon. And God pulls Abraham out of Babylon, and he gives him Isaac, the promised child. Isaac ends up having Jacob and Esau. Jacob ends up having 12 sons. And again, there's an expanding scope of influence with the stated intent of God in Genesis 12, what? To restore blessing to all of the families of the earth. So one really basic application to get us going today, and it's a little bit of a side note, but one of the themes here is that both great evil and great good start small and then expand outward, often with single families. This is a recurrent theme in the New Testament. Jesus paints the picture of his kingdom. What sort of things does he use to present images of what his kingdom is like? A small, tiny little seed that grows and grows and grows, and eventually there's what? There's shade for the whole garden. And it's a picture of Abraham, God's work. Now here, this is why I want to encourage you. This is why this is application. For you parents out there, my wife has a sweatshirt. I might get this wrong, but I think it says, motherhood is kingdom work. Is that right? Motherhood is kingdom work. It is absolutely possible that the very greatest contribution that you will make to the world, to the kingdom of Jesus, is a person that you raise faithfully to serve Jesus. So, that's an encouragement. If you're parents, do not despair that sometimes your days are insane. I have 4 kids, 6 and under, and I often sort of throw up my hands, metaphorically, and think like we literally have a circus in our house. Well, it's actually not. It's a mixture. It's the wedding of a circus to an asylum. But you're doing God's work, okay? And so Abraham, he is God's counterattack, and Abraham's life, I think, shows us two big themes that dominate Abraham's life. And one is just that idea, is God's redemptive work in a fallen world. And Abraham, his life shows us a lot of what God is up to in counterattacking the devil. The other major theme that Abraham's life shows us is that of the right human response to God's gracious work. So, meaning Abraham's not passive in his own story. Abraham's actually following Yahweh. He's pursuing God. He's trying to obey God, and he does that wildly imperfectly through much of his life. But Abraham's a model, so much so that Abraham is only the second person in the Bible to be called righteous. The first is, of course, Noah. But Abraham's righteous. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6, Abraham believed God, and God counted that to him as righteousness. And so Abraham his life is not only the model of God's redemptive work in counterattacking the devil, but he's also the model of what a person who is made righteous in relationship to Yahweh, what that looks like. And his life in that regard gives us 4 overarching lessons, and I'll put these on the screen. 4 overarching lessons that we might say summarize what is the right human response to God. And his story, what happens in the story of Genesis, from Genesis 12 all the way to 25, and the story of Abraham, is that a major theme is introduced of Abraham's dynamic with God, the dynamic of his relationship to God. And then the next several chapters explore that in different narratives. Okay, so for example, from Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, all the way through the end of Genesis 14, is wrestling with one major facet of Abraham's relationship to God, and that is Abraham's loyalty to Yahweh. So this is the first aspect of what is the right response to God. We might call this Abrahamic righteousness. What is God after in his relationship with regard to human beings? And Abraham shows us the first thing of Abrahamic righteousness is his absolute loyalty to Yahweh. And we'll explore that for the next several weeks through Genesis 12, 13, 14. The second piece of Abraham's righteousness is his belief, his trust in Yahweh's promises, even when they make no sense. So, for example, God tells Abraham, I'm going to give you a son. He gives that promise to Abraham when he's 75 years old. He is beyond the point where that type of thing happens. And then Abraham waits 25 years for God to deliver on that promise. And Abraham's trust in the promise of God, even when it makes no sense, he's looking around and all of the sensory data that he can bring into his mind does not tell him that this promise can even possibly come true. And yet, he believes God. He trusts him. The third part of Abraham's righteous response to God is doing, there are two words in Hebrew that are intricately connected, righteousness and justice with Yahweh. So we see this pick up in Genesis 18, and it's explored for the next several chapters. Abraham is actually pictured as a covenant partner with God, who is learning from God what it means to do justice and to do righteousness, and then he's doing that with God. And then lastly, we'll see in Abraham the ultimate kind of test is that his righteousness is demonstrated in his trust that ultimately God will provide for everything that he needs. And we see this in this messianic picture in the story of Abraham being called allegedly to sacrifice his son. And we'll explore that story in much more detail when we get there. So there are four pieces of Abrahamic righteousness. Are we tracking? I'll just take a sip of water here, and if anybody wants to, ask a question or something, we can do that. Okay, so starting here in Genesis chapter 12, here's what I want to point us to. There are three aspects or principles of what loyalty to Yahweh looks like. And that's what Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 9 is about. Three principles of loyalty. So we might phrase it like this. If I say the first thing that God is looking for from human beings is that out of a trust in him and what he promises, that they would first and foremost give their loyalty to God. And then we might ask, all right, well, but what does that mean to give your loyalty to God? What does it look like in the life of a person? And this is what we'll see. The first thing it looks like is this. It is the idea that you have to get out of Babylon and not look back. So when we look at Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, we see this. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Go from your country. Now, if you are engaged with the story as you're reading it, you might ask a question there. And that question would be what? What country? Right? Where's Abraham coming from? And this is not a mystery in the Bible. We know exactly where Abraham was coming from. In fact, we are told in Acts, Stephen, the first martyr of the church in Acts, who dies, in Acts chapter 7, he's preaching a sermon, and he tells us, Acts 7 and verse 2, Stephen said, brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. And he said to him, go out from your land and from your kindred and go into the land that I will show you. So Mesopotamia, in other places in the Bible, it's called Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, What is the Chaldeans? Well, the Chaldeans are a people group that lived in Babylon. All of this is similar terminology. Mesopotamia, Chaldeans, Babylon. In fact, we see this in Isaiah 48. We see a similar call to get out of Babylon. This is a very regular theme throughout the Bible. Isaiah 48 and verse 20, we hear this: go out from Babylon, flee from Chaldea, declare this with a shout of joy, proclaim it, send it out to the end of the earth, and say, Yahweh has redeemed his servant Jacob. So, in Genesis 11, if you go back from Genesis 12 back into 11, we see the Tower of Babel, we see Tower of Babylon. And then the other thing that's in Genesis 7 is a genealogy. And the genealogy there in Genesis 11, it traces down to Abraham, but it also gives us a narrative. It gives us a narrative of Abraham going from Ur of the Chaldeans with his father, actually, and they get as far as Haran. And then they stop there. And the reason that I belabor this is because if you then just turn to Genesis 12 and you see God said to Abraham, you might think that he's speaking to Abraham while he's in Haran, that he's already left Babylon or Chaldea and he's in Haran. Well, the Acts 7, Stephen tells us that's not the case. God first appeared to Abraham before he lived in Haran. That is, when he still lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, when he still lived in Babylon. So Abraham is called out of Babylon. He's told, get out of that land, get out of that country, and go where? To the land that God is promising to show him. One of the things I just want to pause and point out here is that even here in the story, God's incredible grace is being seen. What do I mean by that? Abraham was an ancient Babylonian. His family was from the area where they're building the tower. Like he's from the land of Babylon. And God doesn't look at his enemies and say, all right, I'm just going to wipe all of you out. He actually reaches into the heart of Babylon and he pulls one person out to begin his redemptive purposes, and he calls Abraham out. So Abraham becomes the first link in a great chain of God's redemptive work. But it begins with God calling Abraham and saying, Abraham, the first thing is get out of Babylon and come with me. Israel is later similarly commanded to get out of Babylon. Again, this is a very regular theme. We saw that in Isaiah 48. We see it also in Ezekiel, in Jeremiah, in Zechariah. Through all the prophets, there's this call for the people of God. Now, some of that is because, for example, when Jeremiah was written, the people of Israel were in exile in Babylon. And as they approached the end of the period of exile, God was going to bring judgment on historical Babylon, literal city of Babylon. And he's telling his people, Israel, there, it's time to get out. Get out so that you don't, number one, be a participant in the sins of Babylon. And number two, so that you don't share in the punishment that comes to Babylon. This is pictured in The Pilgrim's Progress. If you've ever read this book, the premise of the book is that Christian lives in the city of destruction. And he gets the message that he needs to get out of the city of destruction. One, so that he doesn't continue to participate in the sins of that city. And two, so that he doesn't suffer in the punishment and destruction of that city. And this is a very biblical idea. In fact, in the New Testament, this theme is picked up and it's applied to believers in Jesus. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, for example, picking up in verse 14, Paul says to the church there, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Let me pause there for a second. Paul's not saying that you never associate in any way with a non-Christian. That's not what he's saying at all. He makes it very clear in many other places, and Jesus makes this clear. It's not that we are literally leaving every single relationship with a non-Christian that we possibly ever have. It's that I will not be a partner with the lawless, with the unbeliever. I will not become equally yoked, that I have the same priorities and I have the same worldview and I have the same values, and I have the same principles, and I have the same goals. I don't. I'm not to be unequally yoked. And continue in verse 15. What accord has Christ with Belial? What portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, now, if you're reading along in your own paper Bible, which, by the way, is a good thing, one of the things that I heard recently that I thought, that was an excellent thought. It never occurred to me. But if you're one of the people that you cruise along on your phone, there's nothing inherently sinful about that, but it's very easy for you to be distracted. It's impossible for you to be distracted by the devil with all the shiny things on your device if you open up a paper Bible and you're reading in a paper Bible. Now, you're not super Christian if you use a paper Bible. I'm not saying that. But on a very practical level, it's good to have your own Bibles with you to follow along. Anyway, if you have your own Bible, what happens here in 2 Corinthians 6 is many of them, they'll put starting in verse 16, they'll put it in little, like a poetically formatted chunk. Does anybody have that in their Bible? It's not a regular paragraph. The reason for that is that they're wanting to clue you in that Paul is now directly quoting for one or more places in the Old Testament. So then he says, we are the temple of the living God. As God said, quote, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now that's a quote from different places in Ezekiel as well as Jeremiah. Verse 17, therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing, and then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. End quote. And then Paul says, since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, bringing holiness to completion in the fear of God. Now, that, again, he is quoting from the Old Testament. Verse 17 in particular is directly quoting from Isaiah 52 and verse 11. And here's what Isaiah 52 verse 11 says. Depart, depart, go out from there, touch no unclean thing, go out from the midst of her, purify yourselves, you who bear the vessels of the Lord. There is a recurring theme throughout the Old Testament and New Testament of getting out of Babylon. Get out of Babylon. That's the first thing that God calls his people to do. It's the first thing he tells Abraham to do, and this theme begins with Abraham. Tower of Babel in chapter 11 of Genesis, and then chapter 12, God says to Abraham, get out. This was picked up at the end of the Bible in Revelation in 18 in verse 5. I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. This is talking about Babylon. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Loyalty to God means leaving Babylon. Now, there's very good news here. The gospel is not that there are Christians and then there are Babylonians, and that these are fixed, static blocks of people. That's not the gospel. So it's like, just hope you're born into the kingdom of Jesus and not born into the kingdom of Babylon, the city of Babylon. That's not the gospel. The gospel is that Jesus reaches into the city of Babylon and he says, take my hand and come with me and get out of there. And he takes people like Abraham out of Babylon and he brings them into his kingdom. But the first step of faith is actually getting out of Babylon. And it is always timely warning to all of God's people, let us get out of Babylon. Let's not be too buddy-buddy with Babylon. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so what are we talking about here? What is Babylon? Because there's a sense, and you might read in the Old Testament prophets, and you can tell at times at least, on a certain level, they are talking about a literal human city, historical Babylon. And the people of Israel were literally in that city as exiles, and they were literally told to get out of that city. But there seems to be this expansion of the concept of Babylon so that Paul can use the same language talking to Christians in the first century in the city of Corinth, and he's saying, get out of Babylon. And Babylon does not exist as a how do I even say it? It doesn't exist as a geopolitical entity in the city of Corinth. Does that make sense? But at the same time, Paul can say, but you need to get out. You, Christians, need to get out and not be friendly with... So what is it? And the best stab I can take at this is Babylon is the system of our world that's opposed to God. So you might get at it like asking this question. I don't know. Okay, I am not really a conspiracy guy, okay? I like to have evidence for things that I want to make claims about. Is that fair? That being said, there are some really wild questions you could start asking, and I actually think it's fundamentally impossible to ultimately perfectly answer them. But you might ask a question like this: who runs our world? Okay, and it's like, well, how do you even begin to answer that question? Well, some good old wisdom would be this: follow the money, right? You might ask, instead of who runs our world, you might say, what runs our world? What does our world run on? Money and power. So who has the money and who has the power? Okay, and however you answer that question, so we could take an economic stab at it, for example. We might say, like, who owns all the, like, big companies? All right, so before you even get there, it's like, well, who owns Fred Meyer? Kroger. Who owns Kroger? Some bank. Like shareholders, but that's like through a bank. Okay, so like, I don't know, Chase, JP Morgan, like one of these big banks. Who owns those banks? Bigger banks. Who owns the big banks, the mega corporations, the BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, these kind of things? It gets super wild. If you go look into who owns BlackRock, you know the answer to that question? Like, as far as majority shareholder, State Street owns BlackRock. But then you look at who owns State Street, BlackRock. So you get to the highest level of this sort of economic thing, and you're like, it's like one thing. It's like one entity. Now, I can say all that on, like, you can literally go just follow money trail. You can that's public, that's evidence. I'm not speculating there. That is how it is. Now, I don't know how that all works, but you could start looking at like who's on the board of BlackRock. And it is people who wield unbelievable power in every sector of the world, in agriculture, in energy, in oil, in medicine, pharmaceuticals, weapons, everything. Computer, tech, AI. And it's like these people wield incredible power. Now, are those individual people, are they in charge? And I kind of think, no. Who's in charge around here? I think the best answer to that biblically is the devil is. I think you just get like all the way up there and you're like, well, who owns all that? And you think sort of everybody. They all own each other, but then also functionally like nobody. Really? So how is that possible? How is it that everybody owns it and nobody owns it? Well, I think that when the devil comes to Jesus and he takes him and tempts him in the wilderness, and he says to Jesus that all of this has been delivered to me, and I will give it to you if you will worship me. I think that there is some kernel of truth there. Because the Bible routinely calls like the God of this age or the prince of the power of the air. And I think on a certain level, the devil is the one running this thing. And so Babylon, what is Babylon? Babylon it's like the world city. It's like you go, like down at our level, it's like we have all these differences, right? We have all these kingdoms and tribes and groups. And the further up you go, the further you get to, there is still like one city. And everybody flirts with that city to try to get their way down on the level where people are really tribalistic. And all the world that's not the kingdom of Jesus is like these varying factions, all of one big city, Babylon. And Abraham's told, get out of there. Well, how do we do that? Okay, how do you get out of that? Well, the answer to that is, one thing it's not physically. The call, especially in the New Testament, to leave Babylon is not a call to physically leave any, because how would you even leave that? There's like one weird answer where you just move to Mars or something, it's silly. But the other answer to that would be super dark, right? How do you leave the world? You get out. Okay, and that's not what Christians are called to. How do you get out of there? Jesus says this, and he's praying for the church in John 17. And as he prays, he's talking to his Father, and he says, I have given them your word, verse 14. And the world, the cosmos, the world has hated them because they're not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They, his people, are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. Jesus is praying for his people, and he's saying, I don't ask, Father, that you take them out, but while they're in the world, that you protect them from the evil one. There's some sense in which we're supposed to leave Babylon while we're still physically, you might say, living in it. So if you go read, for example, City of God by Augustine, that's a huge project to try to, because he's extremely wordy, way more wordy than I am, by the way. But you go read that, and it's his 26-book attempt to answer, what do we do with the idea that we are still living in the city of the world, the city of man, but it's not actually our city. And that's what he's wrestling with. So here's a brief stab we might take at it. What does it mean to leave Babylon? It means that we will not be participants in the priorities, the perspectives, the values, practices, rules of the world that is opposed to God. So what does it mean to get out of Babylon? It means that I do not value the things that the world most highly values. It is not my ultimate aim to attain money or possessions or status or earthly security or power or influence or fame. It's not my ultimate goal to gratify my hedonistic appetites and lusts. And I do not play by the rules that the world plays by. Let me give you a real example of how this has worked out historically in practice. This is the reason in the first 300 years of the early church, the church spread like absolute wildfire. How? Christians were murdered routinely. The church spread by the blood of Christians. They had their eyes gouged out, they had their tongues cut out, they had their arms and their legs cut off, they were burned, they were hanged, they were stabbed, they were boiled in oil, they were crucified, and the church spread like absolute wildfire. Now you can contrast that with the first 300 years in the history of Islam. And Islam also spread like absolute wildfire. How? By the blood of all of the people that they murdered if they wouldn't convert. Now, I would totally be like, this sermon right here would be taken down from social media because people, oh, he hates Muslims. No, that's not the case. This is a statement of historical fact, okay? And the contrast I'm drawing is this, is that the worldly playbook, for example, in the area of spreading your cause, the worldly playbook is how many people can we intimidate, bully, kill, remove? How can we have the biggest bombs, the longest swords, whatever it is? And how do we dominate people into being part of our cause? And Christianity absolutely refused to play by those rules. And so Christianity spread because Christians were willing to joyfully suffer for their enemies. Do you see that? Get out of Babylon. We don't play by the same rules. We don't value the same things. We don't Well, this is going to be one of the major things with Abraham. We don't worship the same gods. And so application, let me just give us one brief application here. You cannot be friends with both Babylon and God. And I'm not saying that to be a cudgel to beat you in the head with. I'm saying it's a literal, definitional impossibility. James chapter 4 says that, do you not know, friendship with the world is, not results in, not might lead to, is. Friendship with the world is enmity with God. And the problem here is that it's hard to get out of Babylon. It's easy for me to talk about. It's hard to do. Why is that? Because Babylon is comfortable, isn't it? At least shallowly comfortable. And it's secure. At least we think it is. And it's enjoyable. At least it is for now. Babylon's very comfortable and tempting. The implication of Abraham's call in Genesis 12, when you read Acts, and most scholars agree with this, and I tend to think this. I think that actually God had to tell Abraham the same thing twice. I think that he went to Abraham and his family when they're in Chaldea, and he says, get out of your country. And then the little narrative part tells us that they did. They did leave. And then what? They stopped. And that's a theme that actually plays out later in the book. If you're familiar with Lot's story, that we won't go into in detail here, because it's later on in Genesis, but Lot has to be told twice to get out of Sodom. He's reluctant to go. Why? Because his livelihood is in Sodom. His house is in Sodom. His property is in Sodom. His circle of friends is in Sodom. Everything that he conceives of as his life is in Sodom. And so he has to be told twice, hey, get out, Lot. And then that's not even without a certain amount of hesitation, and his wife famously looks backward. And that theme of being said twice, you'll see throughout the prophets when the people of Israel are told to get out of Babylon, the command is often repeated twice. Get out, my people. In fact, in Revelation, when you see in Revelation 18, what that literally says in Greek is it says, come out, my people, out of her. There's a repetition of the command. And why is that? Because it's hard to leave Babylon. We're actually, if we're honest with ourselves, there is a certain affinity that we have. For it's like, yeah, I'd like to have nice things. I like to feel like I'm secure. If I could have a little bit more money, if I could just have a little bit more security, if I could just have a little bit more enjoyment. And the thing, I'm not saying that Christians are supposed to be people who are in abject poverty, who don't enjoy their life. That's not what I'm saying at all. But there is a very, very deceptive lure where we can really easily get to where the truth is we want to have one foot in the world and 1 foot in the kingdom of Jesus. And the first thing of loyalty to God is get out. The second piece of loyalty to God that Abraham shows us is that we are to trust God for blessing and identity. Genesis chapter 12 in verse 2. God says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This language of blessing is an obvious call back to Genesis chapter 1. God's intent for humanity. And despite all the lies of the devil to say that God doesn't like people, that God wants people to be sad and miserable and wants to take all of your fun and all of your joy and hold you back and keep you down, that is absolutely not who God is. God created humanity, and the very first thing he did is what? He blessed them. Genesis 1:28, God blessed them, and he said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion. Okay, take over the whole thing. Have all of this. It's all yours to reign over humanity. He blessed them, and he lavishly gave them a world to inhabit and enjoy. And then when they sin, when they reject God's governance over them, and they choose autonomy, and they choose their own path and their own definition of good and evil and their own conception of who they are, it's then that they introduce curse. And these two words become a thematic dichotomy throughout the book of Genesis, blessing and curse. Humans keep bringing curse everywhere they go, and God keeps bringing blessing. Curse, blessing, curse, blessing. What does it mean to be blessed? Well, biblically, because people toss the word around all the time, oh, I'm so blessed. What it means biblically to be blessed is first to have a vital, thriving connection with God, who is the Blessed One. So Jesus will say this later. He'll say, to live is to know God. To be blessed is to be in vital relationship with the God of blessing and life and peace and joy. We might even say that as we then enjoy what flows out of that relationship, the grace and the love and the provision and the peace and the hope of God, we might say that blessing is happiness. Happiness. Now, I always say that fully recognizing that that word can be easily trivialized quite a bit, yes? So much so that, like, some of you hear me say happy, and you think that I'm trivializing the idea of blessing. And I'm saying, no, we need to elevate our idea of what it means for human beings to have happiness. And we have to reclaim the idea that a human being's greatest joy and, yes, happiness is found in relationship to God. And God says to Abraham, I will bless you so that you will become a blessing, and in you all of the families of the earth will be blessed. The other thing he promises Abraham here of note is a name. A name. He says, Abraham, I will make your name great. It's funny, Abraham has an irony in his name. And the irony is this, that he's 75 years old. His name in Hebrew is Avram. Av, father. Ram is great or exalted or mighty. And so Abram means exalted father. Now, of course, that's ironic, isn't it? Why? He's got no son. So Abraham's name of origin, his conception of who and biblically speaking, when we talk about a name, we're talking about more than just like what a person writes down on the, on the signature line. Name biblically is a person's identity, their character, like who, it's this. Like if you ask in your most raw, honest, fundamental sense, who am I? Whatever the answer to that question is, that's your name. That's who you are. It's your identity. And Abram has a name that he's inherited from the world, from Babylon. And that name is simultaneously self-aggrandizing and totally false. Do you see that? His name has it's a self-exalting name, but it's not rooted in reality because he's got no son, and by all accounts, he can't have children. And then God comes to him and he says, Abraham, I will give you a name. I will make your name great. And then what happens? Well, he changes his name. God literally gives him a name, Avraham, which now means a father of great multitudes. And that name becomes true. God gives him a name, and he actually gives him a name that is in accordance with reality, and God makes it reality. So one way that we can talk about one of the basic problems of the human condition is that we are constantly striving for blessing, happiness, and identity apart from God. And we want to invent it for ourselves. This is Babylon. Genesis 11 and verse 4. the people building the tower, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Now, why do they want to do this? Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So their intent, their stated intent is we want to get to heaven on our terms, and we want to make a name for ourselves. And that way we will know who we are, and we will matter. We will not be scattered or lost or forgotten or inconsequential. We will be someone. If we build this tower, if we come to divine, if we come to the heavens, if we come to God on our terms, then we'll be somebody. We'll make a name for ourselves. And God says to Abraham, don't do that. I will give you a name. You don't have to make it for yourself. In fact, you can't. And this is what our world continues to do today. We don't want our identity to be whatever God says it is. People, that's like the basic human condition. We don't want who we are to be dictated by anybody else up to and including God. Now here's the deal. It's a good thing if you don't let other human beings tell you who you are. That's a good thing. Although on a practical level, how do we learn who we really are? And I would submit we learn that in relationship with other human beings. There are ways that other people know me better than how I know myself. Yes? So there's an element where we actually need a community to do this, but I don't let somebody else, I don't act like, well, somebody else says some critical thing of me, and then now that is the sum total of who I am. That's not true at all. And it's a good thing. The problem is that oftentimes that stems from I don't want anyone to tell me who I am, and that includes God. And we also don't want our blessing and our happiness to be dependent on God. We want to be the one, this is like the nature of Adam and Eve. I don't want the most important pieces of who I am and what my life is to be contingent upon God. I want to be in control. One of the reasons, again, this get me banned on social media, and that's okay. One of the reasons that Christianity is so at odds with transgender ideology, so fundamentally, is because loyalty to God means that I do not, in fact, get the final say in answering the question, who am I? And all of the system of the world, and this plays out in so many different places, so what I don't want to do today is like set up this one type of person as like a verbal punching bag, and everybody's like, oh yeah, we don't like, that's not the point at all. It's just to make an explicit comparison to say, listen, this is one of the places where it's seen most clearly, is that you have an ideology that says a person is whatever they think that they are. And there's lots of people having a debate, like, is that mental illness? Is that what? And there's a place for that debate. I'm just saying, biblically, it's like theologically incorrect to say that you are whoever you think you are. That's just not the case. You are who God made you to be. And that's a good thing. You are not a mistake. You are not an accident. You are not, and this is one of the things that we should say to people who are experiencing gender dysphoria or body dysmorphia more broadly than that, is like people do feel sometimes like they are in the wrong body, that they are actually a mistake. And the biblical answer is not just to go along with that. Okay, it's also not to just ruthlessly, cruelly mock it either. It's to say, listen, you're not an accident. You are not a mistake. You are not in the wrong, like God created you. And He created you to be who He created you to be. And that's not bad, that's good. And what we have to do in life is submit to God and discern, who am I? Not according to my whims, but according to who God created me to be. A name. Loyalty to God means that we trust Him to tell us who we are, to give us blessing. This is the destiny of those who are in Christ. In the book of Revelation, in the letters to the churches, the messages to the churches, we see this theme come up several times. In chapter 2 and verse 17, He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. A name. In chapter 3 and verse 12, the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. An application to wrestle with today. Jesus alone is capable of telling you who you are. Your identity, your value, your significance, and no one else can give you the final answer on who you are. Not anybody else around you, and also not you. The third piece of what Abraham shows us about loyalty to God is in the worship of God alone, no matter the cost. The tail end of the story, the last several verses, verse 4, Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. By the way, he said, leave all your family behind, and he's like, okay, and he does it, and he brings Lot. Do you see the conflict there? It's like right out of the gate, Abraham's not getting it right. That should be encouraging to us. Lot causes all kinds of problems later that we'll talk about. And he took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. It's just like they took a whole bunch from them out of... And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Now, it's like the author of Genesis here, traditionally Moses, and I pretty much go with that, is telling us, he's belaboring the fact that who's living in this land that Abram's going into? The Canaanites. And they're rough folks, to say the least. And the Lord appeared to Abram. He said, to your offspring I will give this land. Now think about that for a second. If you're Abraham, you don't tell anybody that that's what God said. Right? You wouldn't, would you? Because you're in the land that belongs to the Canaanites. But here's what I will submit to you, is Abraham did tell them that. He did tell them that. How do I know that? Well, because historically, if you're in the ancient Near East and you move to a new area, the very, very, very first thing you're supposed to do, you move to a new area and you don't know who lives here, who's in charge around here, who's calling the shots. And in the ancient world that was obviously less modernized and secular and foolish than our world is today, they understood that the answer to that question, who's in charge around here, has to do with spiritual entities as much as it does with any human rulers. And so the first thing that you would go, you'd move into a new land, and the very first thing you do to demonstrate that you're not there to cause a ruckus, you're not there to make problems and trouble, what would you think that you would need to do? You'd need to make it obvious to the local who's that you are on their team. And so that would involve probably some statement of allegiance to the local, say, tribal chieftain or sheikh or something like that. But it would also involve offering a sacrifice to their gods. To just say, I'm not here to cause trouble. But that's exactly not what Abraham does. He goes, and we're told 3 times in quick succession, it's the land of Canaan, the land of Canaan, the Canaanites are in the land, and God says to Abraham, I'm giving you this land, Abram. And so then Abraham does what? He builds an altar to Yahweh who had appeared to him. That's worship. And right out of the gate, like that's something in the ancient world that can get you killed. That is Abraham signaling in no uncertain terms that he is not loyal to Chemosh, to Molech, to Asherah, to Baal. He is loyal to the God who called him out of Babylon and promised this land to him. And interestingly, Abraham then worships God at risk to his own life in the very land that his family is destined to inherit. And again, this is a theme that carries through the whole Bible. Remember Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 in the Beatitudes? What does he say? Blessed are the meek. Why? For they will inherit the earth. Christians are not in all that different of a place than Abraham. We worship God alone, and we worship him in the very place, that is the cosmos, that we are destined to inherit. And if you think that's not controversial or generates conflict, it absolutely does. So historically, one of the reasons that Christians end up being persecuted is that when push comes to shove and human states say, we're in charge around here, and Christians say, not so much, that generates conflict. Even if Christians are not people who generally are for like revolution or revolt or creating problems in society. Historically, Christians are like, if you want to have like a good society, you want to have a lot of Christians in your society because they don't cause trouble. They are kind to their neighbors, even the ones that are mean to them. And they pay their taxes even when they don't think that they should. And they generally try to keep the peace to the very best of their ability. Christians are good citizens. And yet, when push comes to shove, the Christian will say, I have to obey God rather than man. And by man, I mean the state. I have to obey God. And the state, no matter what the reason for that or no matter what the expression of it, it can be the most peaceful expression. The state hates being faced with the reality that there are people living in it who just flat don't view the government as the absolute highest authority in the cosmos. They just don't like it. Now, does this mean that we're supposed to cause trouble, that we're supposed to be? No. Even as Abraham's doing this, is he there to cause trouble with the Canaanites? No. No, he's not. In fact, one of the things that we'll see is that a skirmish erupts, and Abraham does have to go and fight. But even as he does that, he ends up, and again, we're not going to preach that sermon preemptively, but he doesn't take any of the spoil of war. And why is that? Because Abraham does not care about all this stuff. He's not of Babylon. And what ends up happening is that Abraham is shown to be the only one dwelling in the land who is capable of living at peace. And the reason is he's the only one that's not playing the power games of the world. He's the only one who is loyal to Yahweh and not to Chemosh and not to Molech and not to Baal and not to Asherah and not even to himself. He is loyal to Yahweh alone. And because of that, he's the only one that actually can live in peace. Abraham's loyalty did not mean that he hated his neighbors. Rather, Abraham's loyalty to God meant that he extended blessing to them. Abraham blessed his neighbors. So too, he becomes then this very early proto-example of Jesus and the gospel. Jesus did not hate his very real enemies, but he loved them and died for them. This is the gospel. Love is demonstrated in this, that God died for us, Jesus died for us, when? While we were his enemies. So too, Christians today are commanded to give our absolute and ultimate loyalty to no one other than Jesus. And we are to worship him alone, but this does not mean that we are then supposed to hate people or do violence on them. It is on this point, I think it's worth today returning again to this thing going on in our culture right now and the legacy of Charlie Kirk. And I say that because Charlie Kirk was first and foremost a Christian. By his own statement, everything that he said, his whole concept of what he was doing came from his desire to honor Christ in everything he was doing. People have, even good-intentioned people, maybe have some disagreement. Like maybe you've watched some of his debates and you think there are ways maybe they presented a point that I agree with in a way that I maybe wouldn't, and that's fine. That's totally fine. There's a lot of people today who are absolutely slandering Charlie. And frankly, it's absolutely despicable to see. It really is. I'm not saying those people. I'm saying what they are doing is absolutely despicable. Why? Because the truth is, okay, what did Charlie do? Did he just go just rail at people that he hated and tell them how much he hated them? No, there are actually people who wear the name of Christian who make a whole entire career of doing exactly that. Okay? But that's not what he did. What Charlie did is he hosted events and he called people up to the front of the line and he handed them a microphone. And he handed them a microphone knowing that they were going to then use that microphone and the loudspeaker attached to it to broadcast absolute lies about him. Now, this is not to make like an absolute saint, hero, Christ figure of Charlie Kirk. That's not my point. My point is that there is a basic picture of the Christian loyalty to Jesus with actual kindness toward your neighbors, even to your enemies. And even though the response of so many people has been to selectively edit his words in order to smear him, right? People did that while he was alive, and they do it now that he's dead. But his response to that was the typical response of Charlie Kirk was always charity, truth, a willing hand to facilitate people talking to each other. And I say all this because I want to make a very, very clear point. I think that we are at a point in our country where it would be very possible for things to go real bad from here. And again, there's a number of reasons for that. One is the situation is certainly not being helped by the people who are lying about Charlie. But I'm also afraid that there are people who are going to look at what has happened to Charlie Kirk and they're going to draw the exactly wrong conclusion about what they are supposed to now do about that. And my concern is that people will then, out of a justifiable anger, they will do the opposite of what Charlie's legacy is, and they will do the opposite of what Jesus himself calls us to, which is to worship him alone and give our ultimate allegiance to him alone, but not in that to therefore hate people and hate our neighbors and, God forbid, do violence to them. It means instead that we refuse to worship any of the gods of this world. We refuse to compromise with the pull to worship the world and the things in the world, but it also means a refusal to worship myself and my own feelings, my own anger, frustration, my own self-righteousness. That's also not my God. To worship Jesus alone means to truly follow his example, his teaching, his calling on us, no matter what, to become like him. And so the application then to wrestle with today, Jesus alone is worthy of our worship. He alone is worthy of our absolute devotion. There is one person that you should not be skeptical of, that you should have no doubts about, and that's Jesus Christ and no one else. And I say that, again, I'm skeptical of lots of things. I'm skeptical of doggone near everything I see. I'm having a conversation with a couple of our members today about AI and how AI can create literally like a podcast interview between two non-existent people talking intelligently about a topic. I'm like, that's crazy to me. That means I do not really believe anything on the interwebs. None. I don't know where that leaves me, to be honest with you. Here's where I think it leaves me. The only one I'm not skeptical of is Jesus. I'm skeptical of myself, my interpretation of things, my understanding of the world, my Like, I'm skeptical of all of it. The only one who's worthy of our worship, without skepticism, without doubt, without qualification, is Jesus. And secondly, along those lines, if we worship anything else, that will become our God, and it will prove to be a devil. If we worship anything but Jesus, that will become our God, and it will bring ruin. And so where we then land today is that we are to follow Abraham's example. We are to give our loyalty to God alone. There are many, many, many things, innumerable things that you could give your life to. Your allegiance, your loyalty, your worship, your trust. You could give it to your hedonistic sense of your own pleasure, to the pursuit of money and power, status, comfort, whatever. There is only one who is worth giving our life to, and it's the one who gave his life for us. So let us give Jesus our absolute allegiance. Amen? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your church. Thank you for the gospel. Thank you for the story of Abraham, the model that he gives for us to follow. However imperfectly, he trusted you and he gave his loyalty and allegiance to you, and you proved worth it over and over and over and over and over again. And we too, we are imperfect, and we don't follow you perfectly, and we zig when we should zag, and we don't get your instructions perfectly right. We too are frail, finite, imperfect, often foolish people. And so we thank you and praise you that you continue to guide us and lead us despite our weaknesses and failures. I ask that you would help us to know where our loyalty might be divided, where our affections might be mixed. I pray that you help each one of us to know how we are to walk in greater allegiance and loyalty to you always in every day of our life, in every sphere of our life. I ask this in Jesus' name.